my full name is Beatrix Elizabeth Groves McDaniel, but it's such a ruddy, huge uh, mouthful of a name that everybody calls me B, which is a lot easier. By the way, it is bee, as in the buzzy things that fly from flower to flower, not beer, which is the stuff you get in pubs. Yes, it's a very old joke, but somebody's got to do it. It's entitled, What's it like to be transgender and disabled? I'm going to talk about this. There'll be quite a bit of anecdotal material in all of this. A lot of this stuff is very personal to me. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. But there are also some conclusions near the end, which hopefully you might find useful. And at the end of the day, provide some kind of position which we can use to march into the future together, I suppose, and if you want to put it that way. So I thought, because nobody ever knows whether I've got legs or not, I thought you might like see a full-length photograph of me. This is me on a left, fairly obviously, which was taken not in this job but a previous job. So wasn't very long ago. So this is a fairly recent piece of photography. So there are some themes I've set up for this particular event. What it's, some of the details of what it's like to be someone who's trans and who also has a disability or is disabled, to use the proper terminology, which is one theme. Secondary is also my personal development and experiences and how I got to the point of where I am today, and some deductions about this thing called intersectionality, which is the overlap, as Nick was saying earlier on, between the various aspects of one's experiences in life, one's position in life, one's characteristics, one's personality, the various aspects of living, which in some respects make a human being what a human being is, and looking at those overlaps and how that impacts upon one's social needs, especially as a disabled person. So that's something I wanted to put to you as part of this thematic material. Confidentiality, anything that's said in this event stays in this event, unless it's generalized information, which you probably could use elsewhere. Use correct pronouns, which is fairly obvious. Be kind, like your granny told you. People often talk about being politically correct. I think political correctness is almost the same as being polite and being kind. And I think that's clearly a very important aspect of all of this, being kind to one another. The last one is the most important one a lot. During the next an hour and a half, you can ask me any question that you like, even if it's very personal. I've heard them all before, and I won't be offended because I have heard them all before in my time. And in the process of doing that, I can be well armed against anything that people might bring up. I hope you will ask questions, because sitting here talking at you for that length of time is really, really dull. Also, you don't learn very much unless you're involved in this in a kind of very discursive way. So I'm very keen on the idea of people asking questions. Now, there are three different ways you can ask a question. One is to put take yourself off mute and just ask when I'm in full flow. I won't mind. I'm quite happy to clarify things as I'm going. The second thing is to wait till near the end. I'll leave about 15 or 20 minutes of time at the end of this particular event to do questions, and discussion and whatnot. But also, if there's something you want to put into the chat, if you put your question into the chat on Zoom, and also leave your email address, I'll get back to you in person with an answer for in whatever way you like, and as soon as I possibly can, probably tomorrow, given enough an opportunity. And that's one way in which you can discuss things with me, and I'm more than delighted to help in any way I can with regard to any of that. I have been around the houses for a very long time. I'm going to let you into a secret. I'm going to tell you my age. I am 67. Yes, they're all saying, how can persons so gorgeous as you be 67? But it's the hormones that do it. I'm really certain of that. So I am 67 and still fighting fit and still working my backside off in various contexts, not only for difference, but also elsewhere as a volunteer. So next slide. we'll take a brief break halfway. Blah blah blah. You've already read that bit. You've all heard me say about that sort of bit already. So, one of the things I want to say to you is that I am a late developer. Late developer in the sense that most of the interesting things that have happened in my life have happened in my 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. I mean, in the sense that most people have exciting lives when they're about 18 onwards. During that period when they do all the weird stuff, they wear strange clothes, grow their hair, strange fashion, dye their hair, and all that kind of thing. It'd be awkward. For me, I think I'm leading my life back to front. All the interesting stuff has happened later in life rather than earlier. And there is probably a good reason for that, in the sense that all the most life-changing events all happened when I was over 50, and I don't regret any of them. Having said that, they've not been the easiest things in the world to work around or work with. Well, I was late coming out as a transgender person. I came out as a trans person in 2008 when I was 53. Would you believe it? 2008 seems like centuries ago. So you know how long I've been in this role. I've been in this role as B since 2008. I was fully out and fully in my current role full time by late 2008, but in fact more completely by sort of the spring of 2009, and I've been living a female life ever since. For me, this has been probably the most extraordinary achievement of all, and there'll be good reasons for that, which I'll try to elaborate on later on. I was also very late. This one's even more surprising. Very late coming out as disabled. Coming out as disabled. My God, how can someone come out as disabled? It was only last year. How can you come out as disabled? Well, it's easy to live your life pretending that you're not disabled. I mean, it's seriously easy to do that, especially if you're a person who was born in 1955, as I was. That you've lived through a variety of different eras in which attitudes towards disability have altered quite radically over time, and the liberative force of movements such as Difference Northeast have had a substantial impact upon the way in which disability is viewed in the early 21st century. But prior to that, being disabled was something people tried to avoid being at all costs. And believe it or not, well, you won't be surprised to discover that being disabled and being transgender are two things I tried very hard to avoid being. So people will also say to me, well, why not just be very brave and come out and just admit you've got you have a disability. It's because of my inheritance. It's because of family attitudes in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that inheritance has stayed with me ever since. And liberation is often a lifetime experience as far as I'm concerned. Today's liberation is built on by tomorrow's events, and tomorrow's responses to tomorrow's experiences create a greater sense of liberation as you go along. So this past year has been something quite extraordinary for me, which again, as I said, I'll discuss more later. And I also had a Catholic education. Yay! No, it wasn't wonderful. My family are not, my family are the kind of British religious family that do things like weddings and funerals, and maybe they might turn up at church at Christmas. But the rest of the time, they're not really believers. As somebody once said, yeah, well, they must be Church of England then, which is probably what they put on the census forms. But my father was a very strong Catholic, and he insisted that I went to Catholic schools, even though I was a little kind of terrible, rebellious little kid, even from the very start. So I got a Catholic education, and there's many people who have had Catholic educations now. The one thing it gives you with great, huge enthusiasm is a sense of shame and a sense of conscience, which blights your entire life later on. Maybe it's a good thing in some respects, but for me, it wasn't wonderful. So I ended up with both stigma and embarrassment and quite a lot of fear built into that. And I spent most of my life fighting all of this, both in terms of disability and in terms of the way in which I am in terms of being trans. So people will ask, what is my disability? Because I'm sure you're going to ask me about that. And why would it take so long to admit I was even disabled at all? And that's because I've got a variant. It's not the pure form. I've got a variant of something called symbrachydactyly. You do realize you probably will get a gold star if you can even say it, let alone spell it. So I tend to abbreviate it to SBD, symbrachydactyly, which is a genetic variant that causes mutations of the hands. In most people, it causes webbing between the fingers, or people will often have extra fingers that they weren't expecting, so they'll have 6 fingers on one hand, for instance. But in my case, I was born with only one joint in my fingers, plus a certain degree of finger. You might be able to notice a bit of finger distortion if I wave my hands about. And I inherited it from my mother. Usually SBD is not inherited. So this is you can see what my hands are like. I have shortish fingers, My thumb is pretty much the normal size, but I've got shortish fingers and I only have one joint in each one of them. This has caused immense issues with me throughout my entire life. It's a small thing. It's an indicator, I suppose, in many respects of how disability works, and also is sometimes misunderstood. It's a small thing and people easily miss it. If I keep my hands behind my back or I keep my arms folded, most people will not even know that I've got this. And I deliberately avoided people knowing. There are good reasons for that, which I'll come to in a second. But it has had a huge impact on my life. And it's only over the past year I've started to realize that this is a disability. It has been a disability for me. Up until that point, I thought that, stupidly, I thought that, like a lot of people do, there's a kind of hierarchy of disability with people who are blind, people who are wheelchair users at the top of a hierarchy. And below that, I was down near the bottom with something minor. But disability is a relativistic thing. It relates to your capacity to be able to do things within the world. And I've found that because of the way my hands are, that I very often can't do things everybody else can, which makes it a disability just like any other. So it's taken me a long time to realize that. Disabled people are not perfect. We don't come to the business of being disabled overnight, especially if you come from an era as I did. Why? Why did it take so long? There is something called the silence of the family. We never mentioned it. My folks never, ever, ever talked about disability. I mean, literally, it would be never mentioned. It's not at any time, not even in the worst crises in my life would it ever be mentioned. So when I was when I was a kid, my family treated disability as if it didn't exist. No one ever talked about it. No one ever asked me if I was having difficulties or what I felt about my hands at all. I had enormous problems with it, especially at school. When I was at school, both primary and secondary school, they had because of the era I lived in, they had no policy on disability and made no effort to make things easier for me. And I failed to recognize I could not do some things. The worst of the lot was the British fetish with compulsory sports that seemed to haunt the whole business of the education system, and still to a certain extent does, where everybody was forced to end up in the gym, climbing up ropes and throwing balls and catching them and using equipment of various sorts. And of course, with the hands I had, I couldn't grip anything with any strength. I couldn't climb a rope. I couldn't, if I tried to, I often fell off, which was rather embarrassing to say the least. And if somebody threw me a ball, I'd inevitably either hit my hands and it would be really painful, or I'd drop it. And so I became deeply, deeply, deeply embarrassed with and being unable to fit into my peer group. I felt totally alien, and the teachers I worked, that I was at the school where I was, they thought of me as this weird little alien teacher who came along and had this thing, that they wanted to put to one side, not take any notice of, because it was deeply embarrassing for them as well. And they had no remedies within the system of schooling at that point in time. I mean, things have improved since then. No doubt if I was a child now and going to school, there would be more done for me. But at that point in time, absolutely nothing happened. So my inheritance during this entire period was one of deep shame deep embarrassment, deep feelings of inadequacy, a deep sense of anger at myself, and a huge amount of anger at the rest of the world. That the rest of the world was extremely hostile to me. That I was like a creature from Mars that had just arrived in a flying saucer and had these weird appendages. How could anybody love a creature like me? Was what used to go through my head during this particular period. It affected my work. It affected I used to play truant from school a lot because I hated the idea of being this little alien. And I didn't fit in and had very few friends because of the whole nature of all of this. I did have very loyal friends, but I felt very much that I kept people at arm's length because of all of that. And as I grew, I internalized this self-hate and the shame and embarrassment. It's taken me more than 50 years to overcome this attitude. Good grief, people. It's how on earth did I get through all of that? Well, yeah, by pretending. It's by pretending I was just average and I wasn't different at all, and not letting anybody know. And if people spotted that I had different kinds of hands, they often thought, "Oh, have you got arthritis?" They often used to say, and I would say, and then move on to some other subject. I wouldn't give them the long spiel about symbrachydactyly because I didn't even know what that word is. I only discovered about 5 years ago what this condition was called. So it's something I very much kept at arm's length. And like I say, the inheritance of my upbringing was something that ruled my life in many ways. So what about the whole trans thing? Well, you're going to love this bit. You're going to absolutely love this bit because being transgender and being disabled are in fact very similar in the kind of story I'm telling you here. In fact, they overlap in a big, big way. Being trans was like being disabled. It was something I hid all my life. Looking back at it now, I can understand why I did that. And it's not particularly unusual for people to do that. There is still a huge tranche of transgender people who will tell the same story, how they spent their entire childhood, their upbringing, getting married. They would go and get married, hide it, get married, and then as time went on, eventually, due to the stress of hiding and being somebody they were not, eventually come out and have to suffer the consequences of that coming out in later life. And it has many of the same fears and ignorances attached to it being trans as it has for being disabled. For instance, when I was growing up, the word transgender just didn't exist. I mean, seriously, did not exist at all. There were other words. I mean, we had other words like cross-dresser. Cross-dresser. My God, I wasn't cross when I was dressed. That was the interesting thing. I was always very happy when I could dress. Transvestite. I never wore a vest in my. It's a joke. Don't worry, you can laugh. It's transvestite. That's and transsexual. The truth of the matter is, these were words of shame when I was growing up. They were people who were on the very fringes of society and were seen as being unwelcome in the polite world of working class families with solid jobs and men being men and women being women and never the twain shall meet, and so on and so forth. So naturally, anybody in those days who could do it would hide who they were. As you will well know, or at least should know by now, being trans is something you're born with. It's almost a condition of the process. It's not something you can choose to be. You can't become transgender overnight. You can choose to dress in the clothes of the opposite sex, or choose to dress in a non-gender specific way, but you can't choose to be transgender. It's not something you can do. It is no more a choice than being gay or being lesbian, or here's a wonderful thing, being disabled. It's not a choice you can make. It's something which is part of your life. And so the crossover between the two is for me a very kind of enlightening thing to talk about. Another thing is, when I was growing, only men, and in the traditional sense of the word, men dressed in women's clothing I ever came across were drag queens and comedians on TV. So, the usual thing, Benny Hill, I mean, well, maybe Benny Hill, or Danny LaRue was a characteristic when I was young. Anyone who remembers Daniel really remembers him as being a gay man who was very famous for doing drag. But that's the only images I ever saw of people who were similar to myself. And the irony of it all, of course, is they're not similar to myself. These are guys who are doing this for the sake of comedy. And in the process of doing that, it caused an even greater degree of shame for me, because I felt very strongly that the only outlet there was to be either a comic or someone who was gay. And that didn't fit me at all throughout my upbringing. The past 20 years, therefore, have been something of a revelation in my life. And it's not for nothing that it's during that revelation that coming out for me became possible. There's me again. I just thought I'd show you another photograph. Just thought I'd show the figure off this time. You can see the hands as well. But there you go. Yeah. I just think, my God, that's a really good photo. Another one from work. So it's another thing nobody ever mentions. Don't mention transgender, because you might grow up to be one. If you don't mention it, it'll just go away. You don't talk about it because it might be spreading. It's one of the things I love to. I mean, I do talk a lot about living a transgender life as part of trans awareness work I do on a regular basis. And one of the things that I like to do when we're doing face-to-face work is there's usually a couple of guys, a couple of cisgender men sitting in the front row. I love to go up to one of them, tap them on the shoulder and say, "Don't worry, it's not catching. You won't wake up tomorrow wanting to wear a frock." And it usually gets a laugh. It usually gets a laugh, because one of the most important things for me to do is to try to take some of the stigma and sting out of the whole business of being different in one way or another. And it's one of those things I try to do this work in a light-hearted way, because otherwise, if you don't laugh, you'd probably cry, because, as my granny would have said. And in this particular instance, I think similar things apply. So, as a family, I'm almost certain that my mum knew I was, in quotes, different, and probably cross-dressing in secret. But again, she never asked me about it. The very idea of asking me about it would have been, she would rather have her arm hacked off at the shoulder rather than ask me about something like that. I mean, this is an upright and upstanding working class family. My God, we never talk about sex and gender, things we never talk about. We probably don't even want to fill in the boxes on the application form or the census, because that's getting too close to talking about sex. So it was that almost literally that sort of experience about me growing up in those sorts of circumstances. Nobody else knew. I mean, nobody else in the family knew, and nobody else in the rest of the world knew. But I dressed in secret. I had a little cache of female apparel, and dressed whenever I could, when people were out and so on. And that's a very, very common experience for male to female transgender people. At school, to quote the Pet Shop Boys, it's a sin. When I was growing up, almost anything enjoyable was a sin. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll were all sinful, and therefore not enjoyable if you were in good cahoots with the Pope. And when I was growing up, the very idea that someone could be respectable and a trans person was almost beyond comprehension. So school wasn't exactly happy with that for that. And as I grew up, I gained guilt and secrecy. Do you realize I would rather be thought of as somebody who was a perv, a kind of pervy person, sexually speaking, than admit I was different and transgender. The reason for that is because if it was that, then I could easily hide it and feel respectable about it, almost because it was part of a kind of subculture out there. But because I knew nothing about trans people at all, the idea of me being somebody who actually was transgender was almost incomprehensible for me to understand in real terms. So I had this real guilty thing about that this was just a sex kick, especially when you're growing up in your teens, when your hormones are raging all over the place anyway, and sex is on your mind 24 hours a day almost. Then the whole idea of that and being trans almost overlap themselves together. And it's only later on, as that all died down, that it became possible for me to think otherwise about who I was. So I lived a secret and hidden life. horrifying guilt. I have awful guilt, something that still hangs over me, and I have to keep reminding myself I don't have to feel guilty anymore. And anxious about being found out, and anxious about being exposed, and really, really scared of the consequences. So there you have. I've got double whammy, as I said in the blurb for this particular talk. Two things going on at the same time: being disabled and not recognizing it, and being trans and not recognizing it, and living with that for most of my life. Somebody should make a movie out of this. It would be an interesting. I can star in it. I can be my own. I could do it myself. But yeah, it's an interesting story, in real terms. So there are consequences to any action. Don't you just know? No, this is not a situation where everybody comes out of this feeling happy. Whether you have a disability or whether you're trans or gay or anything else for that matter. I suppose in some respects I'm lucky in the sense that I don't have even more characteristics, that would be, as you might say, complicating matters than they are. But there are consequences of coming out as transgender, and the consequences of admitting or coming out that I'm disabled. Well, the transgender thing is where the issues start, in the sense that when I came out in 2008, it caused immense shock in my family. It caused immense shock with my partner, who I was living with at the time, and we separated for 1 year, and then luckily we started getting back together again. And I was very, very lucky in having 5 years more of a relationship with her. She was a cisgender woman, and we had 5 years more of a relationship where we got on pretty well together as two women rather than a man and a woman. So that was after 26 years worth. Oh, sorry, that was after 20 years worth of living in what you might call a straightforward man-woman relationship before that. So I'm very lucky about that. But my family rejected me out of hand. I still have a situation now where my relatives don't speak to me at all, because I'm who I am. And if anybody was to ask me the reason for that, I would say it's primarily because of embarrassment. The embarrassment of having to labor under the problem of explaining things to the neighbors and to their friends and to the rest of the world that my sister has a transgender, has another sister instead of having a brother. And in the process of doing that, I think that burden was too much for their concept of themselves to bear. It's probably nothing to do with me and everything to do with how they see themselves in many ways. It's really funny, and amongst all of this also, even though I kept talking about having brachydactyly, people wouldn't avoid talking about it. Yeah. Last week when I was doing some training, and one of the things I was talking about was about how people to the little group we had, I was talking about how difference as it is, it's not just about the color of your skin, but lots of other things which go to make you different as a person. And I used my hands as an example, and I was kind of like walking around the group saying, look, you can have a look, you can even touch. They won't sort of disintegrate if you touch them. But people, you can see individuals feeling, don't want to touch that. There's a kind of almost instinctive business of not wanting to have any kind of physical contact, which is probably fine. I mean, because it's not a traditional thing amongst Asian women for women for that to happen. But I've had the same sort of thing with white audiences as well. So it's a really weird thing that even a small disability like this can be seen as something ugly, even though it's not particularly extraordinary. And also, I know that from experience that people treat you different when they know. They do treat you different. They treat you slightly more with kid gloves than they did before. They tend to think of you as having some sort of innate weakness somewhere inside you, or maybe being in the case of being transgender, maybe being slightly mad. That there is something not quite right about your head. That this whole business of being trans is just an aberration of the mind that you're going to get over someday. Or if there was a proper cure for it all. In a sense, as you well know, there is something called the medical model of disability, which sees disability as something that needs to be cured and not mitigated by changing the way society operates. So it's, in a sense, my disability and also the business of being transgender is often seen as something where medical intervention will make things better. When in reality, what this is all about is society treating people like myself a little better than they do by accepting the fact that I'm different and just carrying on from there and, you know, working around my needs as we go through all that. But that's not the way it works. You know, the whole of society sees trans people as needing medical intervention one way or another. And when, you know, then resenting it when they get it, and then making the hurdles very high to get medical support, and so on and so forth within the NHS system in general. That idea that that things like being trans or being disabled is something we need to put right is something which exacerbates this whole business of feeling out of place with the world and feared to a certain extent. Experience, however, has meant that things are not as bad as I thought they might be. When I first came out as trans, I discovered one of the things I was very, very frightened about was that would be the end of my career as a teacher. I was teaching in further and adult and higher education in the college and university and throughout that system. And I thought when I came out as trans and changed my name and everything about me, that would be the end of it. I would turn up for the first session of courses I was teaching on the first day of term in September, and there would be 20 people in my class. And then on week 2, there'd be nobody. They would, you know, what would go through people's minds would be, I'm not staying if I'm going to have a tranny teacher. You know, that kind of thing. That kind of idea going through people's minds was what haunted me. And you know, the biggest surprise was it didn't happen. In fact, my numbers went up. And I think the reason my numbers went up is people were so curious to find out what it was going to be like to have someone who was trans sort of taking part in all of this. And I think, you know, being a teacher and involved in it, and people were really keen on the idea, sidling up to me or, you know, at the coffee break at halftime and asking me questions like, you know, where did you get that frock and stuff of that sort. So it's kind of played, because of the profession I was in, it kind of almost my identity played into that. And in some ways, I suppose, you know, my disability has done the same thing because of the nature of the fact ended up with this really good job with difference Northeast. So there are advantages. They're not bad, but you know, it's not all bad news. The big problem with it is, I think, is this social concept of having to deal with the fear and self-loathing that's been built up over the years. So what does this all mean in terms of my observations on the subject? I mean, originally intersectionalism, intersectional ideas came out of feminism, and especially as an attempt to make feminism more broad-based instead of it just being about white middle-class people, as it was during during its early period in the 60s and 70s. It became much more wider in terms of looking at the business of the intersectional nature of, for instance, being between a Black woman and living in a white male-dominated world, where the intersectionality between skin color and femaleness played a huge part in the process of how you were evaluated and where you ended up in the social order in terms of poverty, access to jobs, respect, political acknowledgement, and so on and so forth. And that has become part and parcel, I think, a very strong agenda within the disability campaign work that Difference do, and it's one of the things I really want to pursue in the kind of training and campaign stuff that I'm involved with. In other words, we can't change one area of life without changing the others too. You know, it's not enough just to say, I have a disability, but if you're also a bloke with a disability and you're of a certain age with a disability, and maybe this is a job you do or used to do before you had your disability, and why is it you're not still doing it? Is it just because of your capacity, or is it something to do with the fact that it's very much more difficult now to get to do work because of attitudes within the profession? It was good for me in the sense that being trans was not something that stopped me from being a teacher, but I was very frightened that it would be. And I know for a fact that certain trans teachers found it difficult, especially when they're working in the school system as opposed to the post-compulsory sector. Being disabled is not a solitary characteristic. It doesn't sit in the vacuum all on its own there. You know, we don't live on, as I think my friend Chris Artworth once said, we don't live on planet disability, you know, where we teleport down every so often to preach you the good news. That's not the way it works. Most of us are dealing with having families and children and in jobs we have to have, and paying the rent or paying the mortgage and fighting with local politicians and all. There are thousands of other things that go on in our lives. The fact we're disabled just is another kind of hurdle we have to jump over in the process of doing the stuff everybody else does. And being trans alongside that is, can blanket out the fact of disability. Transgender people who are also disabled often find their trans nature is the thing everybody looks at and avoids looking at their disability because they think transness is something that overwhelms everything else. I've got a trans friend who's blind, and she has that all the time. People forget or not even notice she's blind because she happens to be trans. And it's a really awkward thing to have to deal with, where you have to keep pointing out, listen, I can't see what you're doing. So there are issues with regard to that I think are really important. It's this unwillingness to move away from the ghettoization of people into these very simplistic categories of how people are, and unwillingness to take a broader, a much more, I hate to use the word, but I'll use it, holistic view of how people operate as human beings. The nature of human life being the nature of intersectionality in effect. And I think, if anything over the past hour demonstrates that, it's the fact that these two issues that that are part of my life have kind of like had similar characteristics and similar issues, similar kind of consequences within my experience. We need, please, Nick said this at the very start, we need to recruit allies across the range of human experiences. People with different sexualities, people of different genders, people of different nationalities, people of different racial backgrounds, people of different ethnic backgrounds, people of different religions, to get involved with not just what Difference Northeast does, but with the disability movement in general, and look at this as being part of the work that they do. So it's not just doing education, but education which acknowledges the broad spread of human experience. And I think that's a vital aspect of all of it. It really is. And I think my presence changes Difference Northeast's work. And I hope it does it for the better. I hope it does. Well, I'm working at it. Put it that way. And that's about it. I'm not going to say much more. Questions, comments, anything you want to say? And lastly, thank you. That's my email address. If you want to get in touch. That's where the Padlet is, where the stuff is. Padlet.com/bgroves/disability.